Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the anatomy of a massive collapse, specifically the Russian Revolution. Have you ever wondered how a huge, deeply entrenched power system just fundamentally fails? I mean, we're talking about the transformation of Russia from this vast autocracy under the Romanov dynasty straight into the world's first avowedly socialist state. It's literally one of the most profound geopolitical shifts in modern history. So how exactly does a 300-year-old empire just vanish overnight? Well, that's the core mystery we're unraveling today. We're going to look at the historical chessboard, so to speak, to understand the exact deep-seated vulnerabilities that took this static, ancient imperial power and turned it into absolute revolutionary chaos. Because, as you'll see, it wasn't just one single event. It was a multi-stage process driven by some really fatal structural flaws. To make sense of all these complex decades, we'll be using a quick roadmap. First, we'll look at the crumbling imperial edifice. Then, ideologies and rising discontent. Third, war ignites the powder keg. Fourth, February, fall of the Tsar. Fifth, October, the Bolshevik takeover. And finally, civil war and consolidation. Let's get into it.
All right, part one, the crumbling imperial edifice. We have to start by examining the explosive ingredients that were actually already sitting right there in Tsarist Russia.
Just imagine living in a society where 98% of the population, this vast, land-hungry peasantry and a heavily exploited urban working class, is literally holding up a tiny 2% hereditary nobility. 2%. Now, even after the serfs were technically emancipated back in 1861, millions of them were left in a super precarious economic state. They were burdened by massive debt and still lacked actual usable land. So this agrarian question basically became a massive, totally unresolved source of unrest. You know, it's like this whole society was a giant pressure cooker, but with absolutely no release valve. Think about it. You've got an absolute monarch claiming divine right in the middle of an era of rising democratic thought. People's grievances had zero legal outlet because there was no genuine parliament to go to. Plus, the Tsar's pervasive secret police, the Okhrana, ruthlessly crushed any dissent. Add in a totally exploitative industrialization process on top of that, and wow, you've got the absolute perfect recipe for an explosion. Moving on to part two, ideologies and rising discontent. Naturally, all this massive suffering began to brew some really deep intellectual resistance. So the intellectual ferment of the 19th century started giving rise to all these competing visions for Russia's future. Now, the earlier movements, like the populists or narodniks, they focused really heavily on the peasantry and getting agrarian reform. But then there was Marxism. And Marxism really started gaining traction among the urban proletariat. It deeply, deeply resonated with the people who were witnessing the harsh, everyday realities of Russia's industrial exploitation firsthand. And what's wild is that this ideological showdown actually ended up splitting the Marxists themselves. On one side, you had the Bolsheviks, meaning the majority, led by Vladimir Lenin. They were pushing hard for an immediate revolution, one that would be led by a highly disciplined vanguard of professional revolutionaries. But on the other side were the Mensheviks, the minority. They favored a much more cautious, broad party structure. They essentially believed Russia had to fully develop its capitalism first before any socialist revolution could even happen. This fundamental divergence, it's going to shape literally everything that comes next. Okay, part three, war ignites the powder keg. Because, a weak building still needs an earthquake to actually fall down. And for Russia, that catalyst was a brutal series of disastrous wars. First up, you have a really humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, which completely shattered the myth of Tsarist military invincibility. Then, in 1905, the Bloody Sunday Massacre happens. Troops literally fired on peaceful workers, and that just obliterated whatever public trust was left. Finally, we get to 1914. World War I becomes an absolute logistical nightmare for Russia, exposing fatal military failures and completely buckling their economy. Then came a truly fatal miscalculation. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II actually decides to leave the government in the hands of the highly unpopular Empress Alexandra and Grigory Rasputin, right in the middle of severe food shortages. He goes off to take personal command at the front lines. And by doing that, he basically tied his own personal legitimacy directly to the army's military failures. So with rampant corruption, massive hyperinflation, and quite literally starvation plaguing the home front, the very legitimacy of the Tsarist regime just evaporated into thin air. Which brings us to part four, February, fall of the Tsar. The powder keg finally detonates right in the freezing streets of Petrograd. 300 years. I mean, it is absolutely staggering to think about. A 3-century-old Romanov autocracy vanished almost overnight. So in late February 1917, driven by extreme food shortages, women textile workers went on strike for International Women's Day. And the critical turning point here? The military garrison, who were sharing the exact same grievances as the hungry workers, they finally refused to shoot them. Instead, they mutinied. They joined the crowds, and just days later, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. But the Tsar's sudden departure left this massive, gaping void in power. It was defined by what's called duo of vlasti, or dual power. Basically, it was this highly tense, totally unstable tug of war. On one side, the liberal provisional government had the formal, on-paper authority, but on the other side, the radical Petrograd Soviet actually controlled the physical infrastructure, the workers, and the military units. As you can guess, it was a completely unsustainable balancing act. All right, Part 5, October, the Bolshevik takeover. And here, the provisional government makes a fatal misjudgment. They decide to keep fighting World War I. Peace, land, and bread. Now, this is an absolute masterclass in political messaging right here. When Lenin returns from exile in April 1917, he doesn't hit the masses with complex academic theory. No, he offers immediate, concrete solutions to war-weary soldiers, land-hungry peasants, and starving workers. By just hammering on these basic needs, the Bolsheviks managed to completely outmaneuver the moderate provisional government. 1917 was just an incredibly dense year of profound upheaval. You had the spontaneous strikes in February, Lenin's returned in April, the failed uprisings in July, but by October, the landscape had radically shifted. Seizing on the government's weakness, the Bolshevik Red Guards, directed largely by Leon Trotsky, launched a highly organized and honestly relatively bloodless occupation of key infrastructure in Petrograd. By capturing the telegraph offices, the railways, and eventually the Winter Palace, power officially transferred to the Soviets. Part 6, Civil War and Consolidation. Because, as it turns out, seizing the Winter Palace was literally just the beginning. To actually hold on to that power, the Bolsheviks had to survive a devastating, multi-factional civil war against a dizzying array of combatants. Seriously, you had the Reds, which was the Bolsheviks in Trotsky's disciplined Red Army. Fighting against them were the Whites, this really fractured coalition of Tsarist loyalists and liberals. Then, adding the Greens, local peasant armies fighting for autonomy, and even foreign interventionists from the Allied powers. Ultimately, the Reds won because they ruthlessly maintained control of Russia's industrial heartland, and they used a highly centralized party structure to keep their command cohesive. But we have to impartially observe the sheer, staggering human cost of this consolidation. To win the war, the Bolsheviks implemented extreme war communism policies, forcibly taking grain from peasants, and they unleashed a systematic campaign of repression by the Cheka, known as the Red Terror. By the time the Soviet Union was formally established in 1922, millions, literally millions of people were dead from combat, disease, and a horrific famine. The nation was left utterly in ruins. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to consider this profound historical paradox. The Russian Revolution definitely demonstrated the absolute fragility of entrenched power, but it also leaves us with a massive question. Does the pursuit of radical equality inevitably risk a descent into authoritarianism? I mean, how did a popular uprising that so passionately demanded peace, land, and bread ultimately cement one of the 20th century's most formidable authoritarian states? It's a critical question about societal transformation, and honestly, it still resonates today. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the anatomy of this collapse. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.